The Senate is about to gavel into session. No bills are scheduled today. Senators will spend much of the day on general speeches. They're back in session. They will recess and head over to the State of the Union this evening.
This week is going to be a very important week for voting on the President's request to raise our debt ceiling. Mr. President, our debt is $15.2 trillion. The President is going to ask for a $1.2 trillion increase in that debt. These are astronomical numbers. Anyone looking at this can see that we are spiraling out of control in very short order. Just to put it in perspective, the gross domestic product ratio to debt has been in the range of 40% debt to our gross domestic product. Today, Mr. President, we are surpassing 100%. Now, you don't hear numbers like that except in certain places in Europe. This is untenable. When President Obama was sworn into office, the federal debt was $10.6 trillion. In just under 4 years, the U.S. has accumulated more than $5 trillion in new debt. Let's place the President's request in context. The $1.2 trillion that he is asking to increase the debt ceiling will not even cover last year's deficit, which was $1.3 trillion. We are in an untenable situation, and we must do something about it. I think most people who are focusing on this believe that, but instead, attempts to cut the deficit are met with proposals to do what? Increase taxes. Taxes to pay for current spending, and even propose new spending on top of the levels that where we are now. In the coming weeks, the President will unveil his fiscal year 2013 budget. Last year, the FY 2012 budget that the President put forward totaled $3.7 trillion. And he proposed over $1.6 trillion in new taxes over a 10-year period. These figures demonstrate the fundamental problem that we have in this country, which any small business person looking at this can tell you, and that is we have chronic deficit spending. Now, we must accept the fact that mandatory spending accounts for more than half of all federal spending. And the entitlement spending is open-ended. The reality is that Social Security is currently operating in the red. Benefits are exceeding the payroll tax revenue. The programs that are in the entitlement section of our budgeting are in dire need of being updated. We must gradually reform Social Security to meet current life expectancy rates. I have introduced a bill to do that along with Senator Kyl and Senator Graham. It is very important that the President take the lead on entitlement spending. And yet, from all of the things that we have heard from the President about what he is going to propose at the State of the Union message and what he is going to put in his budget, there is no entitlement reform included. Instead, it is more spending and more taxes to cover the spending. The fact remains that we must change the course of this country. If we fail to do so, we're going to be at the same point this time next year, because that is when we could reach the new debt ceiling of $16.4 trillion if the President's request is granted by Congress. The precedent here is vivid. Look how quickly the initial $900 billion request set forth under the Budget Control Act last August has been exhausted. $900 billion has gone since August. This is January. That is a stunning figure. A coherent, comprehensive policy regarding our nation's debt ceiling is not with us. It is non-existent. In order to correct our current fiscal problems, we must align spending to match incoming revenues. American businesses and households know this. They do it every month, every week. Why shouldn't our government be held to the same standards? We have not had a true debt limit set by this administration. The President continually requests increases in the debt ceiling without addressing the core problem, which is spending. While the Budget Control Act included discretionary spending caps and a 2013 sequestration, it did not go far enough. No targets were set, and there was no debt limit put for the annual deficits in the future, and we didn't have a 10-year plan. We could only get 2 years of agreement. We need to take our caps on spending further out. Each year, the caps should bring us closer to a balanced budget. We should have a 10-year trajectory of lower spending. We should have a target to achieve over 10 years the debt down to a specific level which we should be able to set with leadership from the President. This year, we must focus on cutting our deficits and aligning spending with revenues. We are going to have this vote on Thursday, we are told. We have the time and the means to implement a sensible reform for our entitlement programs. Mr. President, that's not going to happen in a vacuum, and it's not going to happen with just the President or with just the Republicans or with just the Democrats in Congress. We have to address entitlement issues together. The Social Security bill that I have introduced, it gradually increases the age at which Social Security would be available to retirees. We all know that people are living longer, they are working longer, they are healthier longer. The actuarial tables don't match the Social Security that was put in place 50 years ago. Will not work. We've got to take the reins. If the President would work with Congress to do that, my bill increases the date of retirement 3 months a year. So it is a very gradual increase. So if you are in the 66-year range and we increase by 3 months, you could retire 3 months later. No one would be affected over the age of 55 under my plan. So if you're 55, you wouldn't have any effect at all. But if you're 54, it would be 3 months later. So it is a plan that can work. And with that minor adjustment, we could make 75 years of Social Security solvent, along with a small decrease in the cost of living increase, but nothing on the core benefit. There would be no cut in the core benefit, only a 1% cut in the cost of living increase. If inflation goes above 1%, there would be a cost of living adjustment. I think everyone would rather have a sound Social Security system and know that it is there for them as a cushion. As we know, Social Security was not supposed to be a retirement plan. It was supposed to be a safety net. And it is a safety net for many people in our country. We are also trying to encourage more saving for security in retirement by people. That's why when we're talking about the 15% tax on capital gains and dividends, it's because we're encouraging people to save for their retirement security. We are a country, unfortunately, that has a very low savings rate. Compared to most other countries in the world, Americans save very little. The 15% rate is meant to encourage savings and helping people to plan and support their own retirement in addition to Social Security. If we made Social Security solvent, it would also bring down the deficit, and we could do it in a gradual way. If we and the President don't take the reins now in a bipartisan way, and we just keep marching along the same path, we're going to have drastic cuts in the actual benefit, in the core benefit going forward. And that would be a tragedy. It would be wrong for our children. It would be wrong for the next generation for us not to be able, in a bipartisan way. I hope the President will mention that in the State of the Union. I hope he will make that a part of his efforts in this last year of his administration before the election. I haven't heard any talk of that. In the previews that I've heard of the State of the Union, we're not hearing anything about entitlement reform, and yet it's half the budget. And we know we have to cut spending if we're going to actually bring the deficits down and start peeling away this cancerous debt that we have accumulated in this country, $5 trillion in the last 3 years and $10 trillion accumulated up until 3 years ago. So, Mr. President, it is my hope that we will start a leadership in the administration tonight at the State of the Union, a leadership that we haven't seen yet, because all we've seen are the same old tax and spend proposals that we're used to seeing. It's nothing new and nothing fresh. But the people of America know that we have to change course. The people of America in the polls say by huge numbers that we're going in the wrong direction in this country. 70% of Americans have said that in the latest polls of how do you feel about where we are now. 70% believe this country is going in the wrong direction. So, Mr. President, only we can do something about it, along with the President. And I hope he will provide the leadership, but I don't think raising the debt ceiling with no plan for the future to cut spending, and that's going to happen this week, that's not leadership, Mr. President, and I hope there will be a change in direction. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President,
Senator from Texas.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection, sir.
Mr. President, I just want to correct the record. My staff tells me that Senator Graham is not a co-sponsor of the Social Security Reform Bill. It is Senator Kyle and myself who are the co-sponsors. And the age at which you would not be affected is 58, not 55. Thank you, Mr. President.
And without objection, the record will be corrected.
Thank you. And I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Florida.
I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized to speak.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized to speak as of in morning business for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. And it's good to be back. Good to be back at work here in Washington, D.C. We have the big State of the Union tonight, which is kind of the beginning of the legislative year, and looking forward to the great challenges and hopefully accomplishments that we'll be able to have together both in this chamber and in this building in the coming year. As we prepare for the State of the Union, I think it's always a good time for us to kind of reflect on where we are as a nation and where we hope to be, and also where we've been. And I think that all of us can look back at the 20th century and say that it was truly the American century. I was fortunate and blessed to be born in this country during that century, and to be the beneficiary of so much of America's greatness. I think those of us who have been the beneficiaries of America's past have an obligation, especially those of us who serve here, to be defenders of America's greatness in the future. And I think that at the core of everything we debate today are these issues about America's future and how we make the 21st century an American century as well. Now, if we examine some of the things that have really distinguished us from the rest of the world, that has made America and life in America different than life in other countries, there's three things that come to mind. The first is this concept of fairness. We are a people that strongly believe in the concept of fairness. And for Americans, fairness has meant equality of opportunity. In essence, the belief that it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter if your parents are poor, it doesn't matter if you grow up in a disadvantaged background, every single American should have the equality of opportunity, should have the same opportunity to succeed and accomplish their hopes and dreams. Now, maybe we take that for granted from time to time, but that is not a universal concept. In multiple societies and economies around the world, I would dare say in the majority of them, there isn't a strong belief in this notion. In fact, people believe that what you're going to be in life should be determined by the circumstances of your birth. Not in America. This chamber, the membership here, basically anywhere you go in America is a testament to people that were born in a very different place or into very different circumstances than the ones that they live in now and the things they've been able to achieve. We believe in fairness. As Americans, we've always embraced the concept of prosperity, the ability to accomplish your economic dreams and hopes. Sometimes that means people make billions of dollars, and sometimes that means you make enough money to provide for your family and give them the opportunity to do even better than yourself. But we embrace the concept of prosperity. And last but not least, we Americans have always embraced the concept of responsibility. The responsibility that each of us have as individuals, as neighbors, as members of a community, as family members. And deep in this concept of responsibility is the notion that while we want fairness and equality of opportunity, and while we want prosperity, we are also a compassionate people that do not want to see people left behind. In essence, we do not want the price of our prosperity to be leaving people behind. And to that end, Americans, as I outlined in a speech earlier last year, have always struggled and have fought for the notion of balancing those two dual important goals, being a nation of prosperity and also a nation of responsibility. So these are the things, these are the core of our values as a people that define our greatness in the last century, and therefore they must remain at the core of who we are as a nation if we want the 21st century to be an American century as well. So let's examine some of the challenges to those three principles that are so important to our future. On the issue of fairness, on the issue of equality of opportunity, what are the things today that are standing in the way of equality of opportunity in America? In essence, what are the things today that are keeping some people from climbing up the ladder, from doing better than their parents did, from being able to pursue and fulfill their dreams, as they should in a nation so deeply committed to the notion of equality of opportunity? Well, in essence, there are a few things that are standing in the way. The first is skills. There are some Americans right now that do not have access to the kind of training they need to build up the skills they need, for example, to create or to have a middle-class job. And part of that is our own doing as a nation. We have, for example, stigmatized career and technical education. For the life of me, I do not understand why we have done that. Why do we not every kid wants to go to a four-year university. Not every kid wants to graduate with a PhD. Some kids just want to grow up and fix airplane engines or build things. That's good work. It's important work. It's necessary work. And yet we do not train our kids to do that. A growing number of middle-class jobs in America require more than a high school education, but less than a four-year degree in college. Why can't kids graduate from high school with a high school diploma and an industry certification and a career that will employ them right away? And that's one of the impediments that's standing in the way of growing middle-class jobs. And if we're truly committed to the principle of fairness, we should invest in that. We should encourage that, particularly at the state level. There's another thing standing in the way of fairness, equality of opportunity, and that's the playing field is not always even. And there are two things in particular that stand out, our regulations and our tax codes. And look, it's not me saying it. It's the job creators, it's the small businesses, it's the people trying to make it. And let me tell you what I mean by that. We have a complicated tax code. It's broken. And here's the deal with that. If you are a large, major Fortune 500 company, you can afford the best lawyers and accountants in the world to navigate it. You may not like the complicated tax code, but you can deal with it. The people who cannot deal with a complicated tax code are the people that are trying to make it, are the sole practitioner, the entrepreneur, the small business starting out of the garage or the spare bedroom of their home. They can't deal with the taxes and they can't deal with the regulations because they can't hire the army of specialists that it takes to navigate these things. Unless you say that somehow we're making this up or somehow, this is coming out of nowhere, let me tell you, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce did a survey of small businesses earlier this year. Here's what they found. 86% of small businesses, which, by the way, is not just the backbone of America's economy, it's the backbone of America's prosperity. 86% of them said that they are worried that regulations, restrictions, and taxes is hurting their ability to do business. This is a fact. So in terms of there not being a playing field that's even in America, in my opinion, the single greatest contributor to making it more difficult for people who are trying to make it is some of the governmental policies, as well-intentioned as they may be, that are being implemented at the governmental level. So we need to invest and commit deeply to this notion of fairness, which is defined in America as equality of opportunity. The second thing we need to continue to believe in is in prosperity. And prosperity in America has and must continue to mean private sector economic growth. The private sector grows and creates private jobs which employ people and turn those people into parents that can send their kids to college and consumers that can spend money into our economy. The creation of middle-class jobs, as I said earlier, is not just the backbone of our economy, it's the backbone of our prosperity. Now, how are jobs created in the private sector? It's not a complicated dynamic. It's pretty simple. Someone has an idea. They have a business or a product they want to invest. They have access to money, whether it's their own money or someone else's money, and they use that money to put their idea into practice. They start a business, and it works. And as a result, people get jobs, and people are employed, and the cycle repeats itself. The job of us here in Washington is to make it easier for people to do that at every level. Number one, making it easier for people to have ideas, and that's the easiest one of all, because Americans haven't run out of good ideas, and Americans haven't forgotten how to create jobs. There are plenty of great ideas. The great businesses of the 21st century, there are a bunch of them right now that exist in the minds of hundreds of thousands of Americans who are just waiting for the chance to put that dream into practice. The second thing we have to do is make it easier for them to get access to the money they need to start these businesses. And that means encourage investment, which means for the life of me, I do not understand why we would punish or discourage investment. Why would we raise taxes on people who want to take their money and invest it in businesses that allow these businesses to grow and hire more people? And so it's important that we make that easier as well. And I would just say that let me talk again about the small businesses. The same survey that I just outlined a minute ago, 78% of small businesses say that taxes and regulations coming from Washington also make it harder for them to hire more employees. So in addition to making it easier for people to make money available to these as investors to allow these ideas to go into practice, we also have to lower the cost of doing business, the barriers to entry. And the equation is pretty straightforward. If you're an employee somewhere working for somebody and you decide, hey, I think I can do this job better than my boss can, I'm going to go out and start a business just like this one and compete against them. Well, if the regulations that impact that industry and the tax code that applies to that industry are too complicated and too burdensome, you can't do it. And if you're a small business that's trying to grow, no matter how much money you have invested, you may not be able to deal with these things as well. So once again, that's why these things matter. By the way, there are two industries that I hope we'll look at as real growth opportunities, as real prosperity creators in America. One is energy. We are an energy-rich country. And advances in technology have made certain deposits of energy that were once inaccessible to us accessible. Natural gas is a great example. We need to stop punishing investment in the energy sector by raising taxes on it. And we need to stop passing regulations that not only make it difficult to access our energy deposits, but in fact take entire areas of this country and put them completely off limits. So I think energy is one that we should focus on, and the other is manufacturing. And there is no reason why, as the rise of labor around the world, rise of labor costs around the world, more and more of manufacturing can't return to the United States. But it isn't going to happen, again, if you regulate people who are looking to do manufacturing, if you regulate them in a way that they decide America is not the place we should do this, and again, if the tax treatment of manufacturing in America puts us at a competitive disadvantage. Let me close by just saying that the opportunity before us all is really real. The 21st century holds extraordinary promise that has no parallel in all of human history. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we can see the kind of economic growth here and around the world that we have never seen before. That's how promising the 21st century is. But it all comes down to a choice. We have to make a choice. Are we prepared to abandon the principles and ideals that made us unique and special? Or are we going to re-embrace those principles and ideals and in so doing make this new century an American century as well? And when I hear some of the talk in this building, it concerns me. When I hear people telling the American people that the way to protect your job is to raise your boss's taxes, I think that's counterproductive. When I hear policymakers in Washington pitting the American people against each other, telling people that the only way you can do better is if someone else is worse off, I get concerned. Because not only is it not true, that type of thought has never worked anywhere in the world. In fact, people flee from countries that think in that way. The American experience has been something very different. The American experience has been that this is a country where everybody can do better, where the people that have made it can stay there and the people that are trying to make it can join them. We've never believed that the way for us to do better is other people having to do worse. We've never believed that in order for us to climb the ladder, we have to pull somebody else down. And to me, this is not theory, it's the experience of my life. My parents raised me with middle-class jobs in the service sector. My dad, for example, was a bartender. And I thank God every night that there was someone out there willing to risk their money to build a hotel on Miami Beach and later in Las Vegas where he could work. I thank God every night that there was enough prosperity in America so people could go on vacation to Miami Beach or Las Vegas, where people felt prosperous enough to have weddings or bar mitzvahs, and by the way, leave tips in my dad's little tip jar, because with that money he raised us, and he gave me the opportunity to do things that he never had a chance to do. Now, we had help along the way. I had student loans and grants from the government to help me get my education, went to our public school system. That's an important role for government to play. But let's not forget that we cannot have more government than our economy can afford. And that's why those of us who desperately want to see a country that continues to have prosperity but also compassion, who believe in safety net programs that should exist to help those who cannot help themselves and to help those who have fallen to stand up and try again, that's why we believe we have to have a strong and robust economy. And what's startling is that we, the largest, most prosperous nation in human history, have built a government so expensive and so massive that not even the richest country in the history of the world can afford it. And we cannot continue on that road either. So I'll just close by saying that I hope this new year, this will be the beginning of our work towards a new American century. Because I know that it worked in the past. I know that this idea of a nation where anyone from anywhere can accomplish anything, it's not just something I read about in a magazine. I've seen it in my own life. And there's no reason why it cannot continue here, if only we do the right things. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Senator from Alabama.
I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would ask consent that I be allowed to speak for up to 18 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today, the State of the Union Day marks 1,000 days since this Senate has fulfilled its statutory responsibility of passing a budget. This is not a little bitty matter, and it implicates the leadership of the Democratic-controlled Senate and their willingness to address the American people honestly and effectively concerning the very significant financial threats this nation faces. As every witness we've had come before the Senate, and particularly the Budget Committee, of which I am a member, has said. Indeed, President Obama, April 29, 2009, when we last had a budget, said this: "A budget serves as an economic blueprint for the nation's future." That is true. It's not an insignificant document that just has a bunch of numbers. It's a blueprint for the nation's future, and you either have one or you don't. He went on to say a budget is necessary, quote, "to lay a new foundation for growth and to strengthen our economy," close quote. And I believe that's certainly true, because the whole world economy and United States business and investment and American people are concerned that we don't have a plan for our future that gets us out of the debt path, some would say a economic growth death path that we're on. They want to see we have a plan to do better. We'll have a speech tonight. I suspect it will be grand in sound and have some popular phrases, but the question is, when it's over, will we have a plan that can be examined? Will we have a plan that will lead us on an improved, dramatically improved debt path, or will we remain as business as usual in denial? So a budget resolution is legally required by the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. It's required by law. It was passed because Congress hadn't been passing budgets effectively, and so the Congress passed a law and said, we must do it, and we're going to require ourselves to do it. By law, the President must submit a budget to the Congress by the first Monday in February. The President has submitted one. He submitted one last year. He sent it to the Congress. It was not a good budget. It was what I have called the most irresponsible budget ever submitted to Congress. And I chose those words carefully because we have, as a nation, never been in a more systemic danger from debt as we are today. Our population is aging. Our growth is not solid. The number of people on Medicare and Medicaid on Social Security are increased. And we need growth and prosperity. And it's a danger out there if we don't change it. And that's why the world is worried about the United States. That's already why Europe is in such a serious problem. So it is important that we have a budget and we lay this out. So the law requires the President to submit the budget to the Congress by the first Monday in February. So we did last year. It was not a good budget because it increased spending, it increased taxes, but increased spending more than the taxes. And over the 10-year budgetary window or plan, it increased the debt more than if we'd not had the budget, if we'd just gone on automatic pilot of spending growth in our country. And that's why it was a failed budget plan. And when the Senate finally voted on it, I brought it up after the House budget was brought up by the majority leader to try to defeat it. I brought up the President's budget and asked the Democratic colleagues, did they support their President's budget? It failed 97-0. Not a single senator voted for that plan because it was irresponsible. It put us on a worse course than we were already on. and nobody wanted to be on record as voting for it. Now, once the President's budget has come in, the Senate Budget Committee, by law, is required to report a budget resolution to the Senate by April 1st. Congress is required to complete action on a concurrent resolution on the budget no later than April 15th. It's a challenge. In the past, it's been a real challenge, and people have really worked hard to meet that goal. Last year, while the Senate did not act, the Republican House met its requirements under the Act to consider and pass budget resolution in both their Budget Committee, Congressman Paul Ryan's committee, and in the full House of Representatives. The chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, however, did not even offer a budget for consideration in committee, which precluded its consideration before the full Senate. The budget process exists in one respect to compel the President and Congress to set forth a plan for the disposition of the taxpayers' money for the upcoming fiscal year and a minimum of 4 fiscal years. The budget has to be a 5-year budget. Often it's 10 years. The President submitted the 10-year budget, which I think is preferable than a 5-year budget. Most people agree. Setting forth such a plan requires setting priorities, does it not? A household does a budget, a city, county, or state does a budget. They have to choose, with their limited resources, the priorities that they can fund. How to use those scarce dollars between, in our case, discretionary spending, which is subject to the annual appropriation process, and the mandatory spending programs, which is provided under rules set forth in permanent law. And those programs include food stamps, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and a lot of other programs. So mandatory spending programs currently comprise almost 60% of our spending. They're on automatic pilot. If you reach a certain age, if you lose your job and your income falls below a certain level, you are entitled to certain benefits. And you can walk into the government and you ask them for that food stamp, or you ask them for governmental assistance, and if you qualify, it must be given to you whether the government has any money or not. And if those programs are out of control and are growing too fast and are not properly managed, Congress has to change substantive law, not just change the budget to deal with it. So this is almost 60% of our budget today, the mandatory part. So the budget process, through the use of reconciliation, is the only mechanism available for Congress to compel oversight and review of mandatory spending programs. Without the discipline provided by the budget process, these programs proceed on automatic pilot. And I would just note that's the fact that we are at the so-called Budget Control Act top number does not deal at all with this 60%. So, importantly, the numbers that were deemed by the Budget Control Act, which was passed last summer in the wee hours of the morning, and just to avoid a budget governmental shutdown, that Budget Control Act, not subject to any amendments, not brought up for debate, set the number for spending. But it only set the number for discretionary spending. So the Budget Control Act effectively told Chairman Conrad to provide for discretionary spending at the levels of the Budget Control Act caps, and for mandatory, the 60%, to stay the same. And revenue policies, tax and policies at levels estimated under the Congressional Budget Act baseline. So mandatory spending and tax increases and tax policies would be controlled by the Congressional Budget Office baseline. Business as usual. the definition of business as usual for 60% of our budget. So the so-called deemed budget is not a real budget, and it's not, and the process used to adopt it is not the kind of process that's legitimate, not the kind of process that's required. In the Budget Act, you must have a committee markup. You must have 50 hours of guaranteed debate on the floor of the Senate. An unlimited number of amendments can be offered. A public, open discussion about the dangers facing this country and how senators are going to deal with it. And they have to vote. And they have to vote multiple times. And the Democratic leadership, supported by Democratic members, did not want to go through that process. And that's why the Democratic leader, Senator Reid, said it's foolish to have a budget. He didn't mean it was foolish for America to have a budget. He meant it was foolish for them to have to vote publicly and be accountable for the serious challenges facing this country. And I think that was a big reason for the shellacking a lot of members of Congress took in the last election. American people want Congress to be accountable. Congress works for them. We're not on our own up here to do whatever we want to. American people are watching us. 40 cents of every dollar we spend is borrowed. Are the American people not legitimately unhappy with us? Why should they be satisfied with Congress? Why should we be looked up to as someone who's leading the country effectively? We won't even bring up a budget? Now, I just want to say, the Republicans fought for a budget. I'm the ranking member of the Budget Committee, Republican on the Budget Committee. We pleaded with them. We protested. But the leadership in the Senate has the power to set the agenda. And a minority can't call a budget hearing in the Budget Committee, nor can they require a real budget to be brought forth for full debate on the floor of the Senate. So this is where we are. I just have to say it, because our colleague, who I really respect and like, Senator Conrad, was saying we really don't need a budget today. And apparently they're not going to produce one again this year. That's not accurate. We do need a budget. And we need to go through the process, because the American people need to know what the Debt Commission told us, which is that we don't have the money to keep spending as we're spending today. So a real budget would have required a weighing of the spending demands placed on the federal government and the available revenues, and reached a consensus on what activities the governments would pursue and how the government would pay for it, including the amount that would be added to the debt. How much debt are we going to be increasing, and how much will be left to future generations? So the failure of our Democratic leadership in the Senate to seriously and credibly address our mandatory spending programs, which all experts and observers tell us is on an unsustainable course. Everyone tells us that. What we're doing today is unsustainable. For example, the budget that the President submitted called for deficits every single year for the next decade. It goes from about $1.3 trillion now. It was going to drop down to the lowest single year, a deficit of $740 billion. And years 7, 8, 9, 10, it would be going back in again to almost $1 trillion. We spend this year $650 billion on Social Security. By the 10th year, according to the Congressional Budget Office analysis of the President's budget, the interest we would pay on the debt alone, just the interest, would be $940 billion. Today it's $240 billion. This is how you get into the European crisis. This is why experts and economists have told us our spending and debt situation is unsustainable. That's not a frivolous word. They mean it's unsustainable. contending that the creation of the super committee absolved the Senate of that responsibility to produce a budget is laughable and it's not credible, and I reject that. Instead, so we're told that deeming of budgets or spending caps for FY 12 and 13. By the way, these so-called spending caps and deemed budget only covers 2 years, not 5, not 10, just 2 years, and only discretionary spending. So they're saying that those 2 years of maintaining spending at levels determined in secret, brought out in the 11th hour before the Senate for an up or down vote without amendment to avoid a government shutdown, to contend that that meets the requirements placed on this chamber for responsibility and fiscal rectitude, it just cannot be sustained. Nothing could be further from the truth. Passing a real budget is indeed not easy, particularly now because we have such a serious financial crisis. Tough decisions are going to have to be made. Perhaps our Democratic leadership don't want to show the Americans how much their big spending agenda truly costs. That's what a budget shows over 10 years, how much we plan to spend, how much we're going to cut, how much we're going to tax. Maybe they don't want to know, the people to know how much they intend to raise taxes and how much of that falls not just on the rich but on the middle class. I can show you the budget that the President submitted. It goes beyond the rich, and it was a big tax increase. Well, the failure to propose and debate on the floor openly a detailed long-term fiscal plan may be considered by some to be smart and not being foolish, but it is sending our country toward the fiscal cliff. Our Democratic colleagues wish to pretend to the nation that they have an actual budget plan. And if they want to do that, they must find in their files the secret document they produced last year. And finally, once and for all, make it public. Senator Conrad said, I have a budget. And he said we were going to have a committee markup, and I'm going to present our conference's, the majority's budget plan to the Budget Committee, where he has a majority of his members. And he was prepared to do that. He was prepared to do that, I thought. I was ready to get prepared to have the hearing. So when we got ready, somehow it didn't happen. It got put off. It got put off again. And then in the days that followed and we had a fuss, Senator Reid eventually said, basically, I made that decision not to have a budget. It's foolish to have a budget. So we never saw this budget. He said publicly they had one. Why? Are they ashamed of it? Were they afraid to bring it out? Did not anyone want to see it? We were prepared with our little calculators to see how much taxes were going to increase, how much spending was going to increase, how much debt was going to increase. Were we going to change our debt's trajectory and make the country better, put us on a sounder path? That's what we wanted to know, and we were told we were going to get it. We did not. So instead of an open, accountable process where the public votes are taken, our constituents can hold us responsible for the leadership we provide, we got at the 11th hour deals, month of secret meetings, and political maneuverings. The primary aim of the process, it looks to me like, was political advantage, not the advantage for the people of the United States. So I believe that when the majority leader and his majority colleagues chose to block the lawfully mandated budget process and not bring up a budget, not have committee hearings and actual votes, not have 50 hours of floor debate, not being able to allow amendments that deal with the budget and spending, they put politics over the nation's interest. They rejected a duty they have by all just deserts and logic and also by law. They did so for their political convenience. And I think if they continue to fail to produce a budget, to allow it to be discussed, to show what their plans are for the future, they have forfeited the leadership that they have asked for in the United States Senate. If you can't produce a budget and you don't have the gumption to lay out your plan for the future and have numbers that can be studied and examined, added and subtracted, you can't do that. You're not willing to face up to that responsibility. You don't deserve to lead the United States Senate, because that, at this point in history, I think, is the most significant matter we face. Our economy is not doing well. Our debt is surging. This year, the debt came in, as of September 30th, another $1.3 trillion. 3 consecutive years of deficits over $1 trillion, averaging $1.3 trillion. Can you imagine that? The highest deficit President Bush ever had, and it was too high, was $450 billion. But for 3 years, we've averaged $1,300 billion. The debt is surging out of control. And the Budget Control Act that purports to make a change in that trajectory only reduced spending by $2 trillion, only reduced the deficit, projected deficit, over 10 years by $2.1 trillion. When every expert, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives, before our Budget Committee told us you need to have $4 trillion over 10 years in reduced deficits. Because under the projections we have on the Congressional Budget Office, we're on track to add $13 trillion more to the debt in 10 years. 13 trillion more, doubling the 13 trillion, now over 13 trillion in debt we have. That's why we can't continue. We need a plan to change that. Instead, we got a minimum reduction, I guess, from approximately 13 trillion to 11 trillion out of the Budget Committee. So we'll add $11 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years rather than 13. That's not enough change. $4 trillion, in my opinion, based on the studies and the hearings and the testimony of the witnesses I've heard, is not enough. We need to do a good bit more than that. The House proposed a better plan by far that would have changed our debt course, but it was never, the Senate did not do its responsibility to meet that challenge or the position of the House. Mr. President, I appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts. We look forward tonight to the President's State of the Union. I hope that he will do more than do his normal eloquent processes and lay out a real plan, a plan that can be studied, a plan that can be evaluated to put this nation on a sound fiscal course. Because until we do, jobs will not be created. And we've got to have growth. There's a lack of confidence in our economy, and the greatest foundation of that lack of confidence is the debt. And I would just add briefly, there are things you can do to create growth and jobs without increase in spending and without increase in debt. How do you do it? You eliminate every single regulation that's unwise. You reform our tax code to create a growth-oriented tax code as much as possible to enhance growth. You produce more American energy and stop taking policies and actions that prohibit the production of American energy, creating American jobs, creating wealth in the United States, stopping to export that wealth to Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or other places like that. We've got to end this health care bill that was passed. Already, health care premiums for average Americans have gone up, a family of four, $2,400 already. It was supposed to bring those costs down. That is a hammer blow to the middle class. So we're talking about jobs, growth, progress. Those are the kind of things we need. We can do it without government debt, without more government debt and more government spending. And that's what I'll be looking for tonight. I thank the chair and would yield the floor and note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.